And like these other people that become so important, they start asking the right kinds of questions. They become important, and these people make them important for other people in the world. They may not come up with the right answers, but they come up with the right questions, and they make them worthy of investigation. Okay? He published a monumental work called Histoire Naturale. Histoire. Which is natural, it's just a work called Natural History. This is a big deal, too, because it was in 44 volumes. I think the last 9 were published after he was dead already. But you can imagine a book that big that's just dealing with natural history, our understanding of the rest of the world. And this became an important work for many, many years after that in the study of biology and the study of natural history. One of the things that he wrote about or understood is that organisms are really a product of where they live. Organisms from different places have different characteristics, so they seem to be fashioned in different ways in different places, and this gives rise to the study of the distribution of organisms across the globe, and this is what we call, and have mentioned already, biogeography. And so really this person is the founder of this type of investigation where we study the distributions of plants and animals across the landscape, and this is what biogeography is about. Again, he discussed a lot of different evolutionary biology kinds of problems, and again, even though he came up with the wrong conclusions and insufficient answers, he made these questions, he brought them to the forefront, and they became important in the minds of other scientists and other natural historians and other biologists. He discussed the origins of the Earth, and he talked about, remember we talked about sedimentary rocks? So he wrote about the origin and the nature of sedimentary rocks, and one of his conclusions is that the Earth is quite a bit older than we think it is, because there's certainly not enough time for these kinds of rocks to develop to the great extent that they exist in these very deep continuous strata. There's not enough time in our current understanding of the age of the Earth for that to have happened, so perhaps the Earth is much older than that, and so he becomes a proponent for the greater age of the history of the Earth. He also established the importance of this concept of extinction. So that people are discovering things, an indication of things that lived in the past that don't seem to be around today, and so this becomes a concept worthy of discussion and investigation, whether organisms really can go extinct and not exist anywhere at all. He also raised the issue of whether very closely related or very similar species could have come from a common ancestor. That might be why we see multiple species that are fairly similar to each other and yet they're different. One possible explanation for why this is so is that they all came from something else that was quite similar to them. Like we were drawing on the board the other day when we were talking about diversification of lineages. He's thinking that this might be a possibility for the similarities between very similar or closely related different species. He also thought that there might be something to this notion of reproductive isolation. That might be something that plays a part in the nature of these things called species that we're going to talk a lot about during this semester. So bunches of individuals that reproduce among themselves and yet they don't reproduce with other things, maybe that has something to do with the nature of species and perhaps the development of different kinds of species. A lot of these things he doesn't have answers for again, but he's turning these into big deals that people write about and talk about. The other thing that he did is he took this thing that I guess you could call a hobby of natural history, and he makes it into a field of science, a field of endeavor, and it really professionalizes it. People go out and start making a living doing this kind of science, doing natural history and general biology. People weren't doing that before, and now it's something important enough that people can start spending their time on. So he brings this idea, these evolutionary kinds of ideas, into the realm of organized science. And when you do that, people take it seriously, and people work harder to find answers to things. And we can't overemphasize the importance of asking the right questions. Nobody's going to answer these questions unless they know that they exist, and they become worthy of investigation. Okay? That's Buffon. The next guy that we want to talk about is Linnaeus. Say his first name, Carolus Linnaeus. He was from the we'll just put down 1700s. He lived for most of the 1700s. And he was one of the two really great scientists of the 1800s, the other one being Buffon that we just talked about. And Linnaeus was from Sweden, so he's our first guy that we're talking about that isn't from France. He was from Sweden. He was a naturalist. He did lots of things, but one of the things he really got interested in doing, and that's this thing that we call taxonomy, and putting names on organisms. And he really set out to put names on all the organisms on Earth. And he had people going all throughout Europe and bringing things back to him, and he was classifying them, and he came up with this system that we'll talk about later in this semester called binomial nomenclature. By which organisms get a name that consists of two words. Again, we'll talk about this much more in depth later on. How long have people been putting names on organisms? Is that a new thing that's starting in the 1700s? No, they've been doing it for a long time. Again, you can go back to as soon as people could contemplate things like that, they put names on things. Remember, it gives you some kind of attachment to something, and you can say a very few words using these names that convey a lot of information to somebody else. And that's also what we use to organize them and put them in different categories. And this is one of the things that Linnaeus worked on. He started taking these things that we call species, giving them names, and developed this new system for giving them names. But then he also categorized them, and he put similar species into a category that he called a genus, and you could also see that there exist similarities among different genera, and you can put those into other groups that we might call families, and so on, into orders, and even classes of organisms. And so he built this nested hierarchy that is a classification system that we still use today. Later on we'll talk about it much more, we'll talk about some problems with doing things that way. But the big thing here is that Linnaeus recognized that there is some sort of organization to living things. There seems to be some kind of relationship among different kinds of things. And really that life is very lumpy. It's not a continuous rainbow of individual organisms. There are a whole bunch of individuals that are very similar to each other. And then there are a whole bunch of other individual organisms that are similar to each other and yet different than those other things. Life exists in these clumps. And you can see this clumpiness at different levels of resolution. If you look really close, the lumpiness exists in species. But if you back up, you see there is also lumpiness at higher categories. Like we have a big category that we might call birds. A big lump of life that has a bunch of characteristics that we call them birds. and some other things that we would call reptiles, and others that we would call composite flowering plants, or we might see a whole bunch of things that we call grasshoppers. But life, the important thing that you recognize is life is not a continuum. It exists in these clumps, okay? Why? Why is life not just a continuum of varying individuals? Why does it exist in these clumps of similar individuals at varying levels of resolution? Okay? He didn't know the answer to that. People don't know the answer to that for another 100 years, but he just notices that's the way it is, and so his classification scheme is organized around these lumpiness categories of life. So maybe we can say life is lumpy, but not, that doesn't mean like when you go through and live a long life you had good days and bad days, but it exists in clumps of individuals with different characteristics. Now, if we had him in here, we asked him about change and stuff like that, he is totally of the sense that life doesn't change. There is no, we don't even have this word really, or getting close to having this word of evolution, but he believes in the constancy and the fixity of species. We have these things that life exists in, these lumpy things, these at the small scale, these things that we call species, but that's the way they've been, and that's the way they are, and they're always that way. And some of the ways that we classify life today go back to Linnaeus, and you can see in this system this notion that things are unchanging and invariable. If you go out and give a name to some organism that doesn't have a name, one of the things you have to do is designate a specimen, a single thing that you could hold in your hand that is the name bearer for that particular species. It's called the holotype specimen, and that is supposed to represent the entirety of that species. Okay, and we still do that today. If you describe something in 2016, that's part of the rules that you have to do. But one of those things that indicates is that's not very reflective or very representative of particular species. It's like if somebody came here from some distant planet or something like that, and they collected human beings. If they just took one of us back, okay, that might be the type specimen of these creatures that they discovered. But look at any one of us. Do any one of us represent our species? Well, not very well. So if you were coming here and you were going to collect and specimens to represent the species you discovered here, what would you do? Would you just get one? No. I'd shoot little ones, I'd shoot big ones, I'd shoot skinny ones, I'd shoot fat ones, get them from different places, okay? And then you'd have a whole bunch of individuals that are extremely similar to each other, but they also vary in small ways that says something about those, okay? So when we, later on in this class, when we talk about species concepts, we'll see that Linnaeus had a species concept that's called a typological species concept, and that's that these things, it's reflective of this notion that species don't change. They are the way they are, and they've always been this way. Yeah, there's variability, and he was well aware of variability, but they've always been this way, and they're always going to be that way. So Linnaeus is discovering some things. He's doing things that we still use today, and he's discovering things about the nature of life and making them well known. And this lumpiness, this somewhat organization that life exhibits is useful to his classification scheme, but he doesn't know why it is that way. But that also becomes a good question. Why is life that way, and not just some continuum of varying individuals? So one of the things we have these things that we call species, but what are they, and how did they get to be this way, and where did they come from? So this question of the origin of species these entities that we can see with our eyes, where did they come from? How do we explain their origin? We know that. Now here's another problem, another question that's just begging to be answered. So it becomes another piece of the scientific endeavor to solve. So people like Buffon are actually teetering on the edge of real evolutionary thought and evolutionary ideas. And even some of them, like Maupertus, are bordering on some kind of a temporal aspect of change or a temporal aspect of the scala naturae, but none of them were able to break the bonds of some of these old ideas that are weighing heavy on their mind that they can't give up, and being that they can't give those up, they can't make much headway toward understanding the reality of the situation. So none of these people, we would think of them as being proponents of something that we call evolution. It's not until we get to another guy in France named Lamarck, and let's see if we can put down, so he's like late 1700s to early 1800s. He has the best name of all. His name is Jean-Baptiste Pierre Antoine de Monet, the Chevalier de Lamarck.
What?
Write that on your checks every day. As far as the idea of extinction goes, he kind of thinks, well, I don't know if extinction really takes place, but one explanation for the disappearance of things from the past is why you don't see them today, is maybe these things in the past turned into something else that we do see today. So the nature of the characteristics of a particular species may change so much that it is something else, and the old thing that it was is no longer there. Okay, so that's his explanation for extinction. It's a very evolutionary kind of explanation, and he's incorporating change into the nature of organic things. He actually was a tutor to Buffon's son. He went to work at the Paris Museum, and he first off started being the curator of botany and plants. There are lots of plants that are named by Lamarck, and then he became the curator of invertebrates. In fact, he's the guy that came up with the term invertebrates. Okay, and so he had at his disposal huge collections of specimens of extant organisms, but also at his disposal fossils of things that were representative of things of the past. From studying these organisms and from his experience, he came up with the notion that organisms can change over time. He also is the first person, I guess he's really our first person that we could think would be an evolutionist, and he even comes up with a mechanism by which things can change. It's wrong, but it's still a mechanism proposed to show by which things can change. And in particular, where we get things that we would call adaptations. So, we have these things, we still use this word today to describe things. Well, just adaptation is a trait that increases the ability of an individual to survive and reproduce compared with individuals without that trait. So Lamarck is realizing that organisms have these things called adaptations. They're characteristics that they seem to have to make them real good at living where they do at a particular place at a particular time. And these are the things that we call adaptations. And he came up with a mechanism by which organisms, as they change through time, how do they become adapted to their environment? How do they acquire these characteristics that we would call adaptations? And his explanation for how organisms acquire adaptations is what's called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Okay? And in this, what takes place during an organism's lifetime influences what it can pass on to the next generation. It would be like if I spent a lot of my time lifting weights, and my arms got bigger, and my arms got stronger. When I had kids, they would have what? Bigger, stronger arms than they would have if I never lifted weights. Okay, so in his mind, things that you do during your life can influence the characteristics that you pass on to your kids. Okay? Does it work that way? No. In 2016, we know it doesn't work that way. Remember, these people, they knew that organisms kind of had kids that were a lot like them. The progeny looks a lot like the parents, right? They had no idea, oh no, they had some ideas, but they're incorrect, so they really didn't understand anything about inheritance. That wasn't until much later. Let me read you a little paragraph of what Lamarck says on how characteristics are passed on from generation to generation. Lamarck says, in every animal which has not yet passed beyond the limit of its development, I don't know what that means, the more frequent and sustained use of any organ gradually strengthens, develops, and enlarges that organ, and gives it a strength proportional to the length of time it has been used, while the constant disuse of such an organ imperceptibly weakens and deteriorates it, progressively diminishing its faculties until it finally disappears. So not only can you use certain parts of your body, and they will be more developed in your kids, but the parts of your body that you don't use are diminished in your kids. This is the another way to write this is the issue of use and disuse. So things that you use become perpetuated and enhanced, and things that you don't use get diminished and ultimately would go away. This is Linnaeus's mechanism. This is Lamarck's mechanism by which organisms acquire adaptations, and the mechanism by which, within a lineage or a group of organisms that's going through time, this is what drives their changes. At the time, they used to think that inheritance came from these things that were called, I think they were called gemmules, and they existed throughout your body, and they interacted with all the parts of your body. And then they somehow came together and imparted something on your germ cells that were passed on to the next generation. And so things that did happen to the various parts of your bodies could convey some kind of information to the next generation. Okay? And we know that doesn't work that way. And you could think of some real easy experiments. He could have done them. What's a good experiment to show something about use and disuse, or that could test the hypothesis of the inheritance of acquired characteristics? What could you do? Any ideas? Well, I think a real easy one is, and I think people have done this just to do it. You can take mice and take scissors and cut their tails off, right? And then let them breed, and their kids have what? do it again. Cut the tails off, let them breed. Their kids have what? How many times, how many generations can you cut their tails off and they'll still have tails? You could do it for 100 years. I'll bet you a lot of money that they're always going to make, but they never had, you cut them off when they're young. They never had them when they were living. So there was, they never really used them, or in this case, it's like they didn't have them, so because of this notion of use and disuse, they should start getting smaller and smaller tails until they went away, right? Okay? And what happens? Something else must be going on. They have no idea what that is, but this is the way that Lamarck was. Lamarck was a really smart person. If you look at the things he did throughout his life, the people that we're talking about here are very intelligent people. Is that why these people that we're talking about here in this line of this timeline of people, is that why these people were able to figure this out and not somebody from Ecuador? Were these people smarter than people from Ecuador? Why didn't they figure it out there? Kinda. Think of I'm just picking Ecuador for you know, because I can think of it. What are the people in Ecuador doing in the 1700s? They're living day to day, okay? If you're concerned with getting food for today and having enough for tomorrow, and that's that's all you're doing, okay? You don't have time for all these other endeavors, okay? These people in Europe by this time, there are different kinds of people with different jobs, okay? Some of those people are doing a lot of work and they don't have time for this sort of stuff. Other people, you know, have money, and money equals what? Time. If anybody, what'd you say?
Power.
Yes, but power too. But you know, if anybody ever offers you money or time, take the time, because that's finite. You can't get it back. So they have time to do these things. Okay? Are there stupid people in Ecuador? Sure. Were there really smart people in Ecuador? Yeah. Were there stupid people in England? Of course, lots of them. But there were also some really smart people there. At that place, at that time, and they had the opportunities to do these things. And those questions, the people in Ecuador weren't thinking about these things, weren't solving these problems, because those aren't questions of any relevance to them. Okay? Collecting specimens of flowers and gluing them to paper and putting names on them, well, they wouldn't do such silly things. You know, I got to make it till tomorrow. So this is a piece of geography and time in history where there are some individuals that are both smart and have opportunities to do these things. Okay, and that's the difference there. It's not that people in one part of the world are smarter than any other place in the world. It's just this time, at this place, this culture, this society, and the background of these people that have time to do these kinds of things. And Lamarck was a brilliant scientist, and he knew lots of stuff and solved lots of things, and we could call him the first evolutionist because he's understanding that the world changes and organisms can change into other things. Another thing that he was kind of bold about is that he included human beings in his descriptions of organisms changing over time and becoming something else. That's something that other people at other times didn't. They kind of put people separate than sunflowers and earthworms and cats and stuff like that. But Lamarck realized it's all the same for all of these things. Let's see. So his ideas are really in stark contrast to the great understanding of most of the other people. It's not a steady world, it's a changing world. He also, like some of the people, his contemporaries and some before him, that the earth is very old. It's not very new, it's something that's very old. It's much older than we think of it as. And the environment, what's going on, and organisms' behavior has something to do with when they change, how they change, and the characteristics that they come up with. Okay? Any questions on Lamarck? Okay. guy we want to talk about. Is Cuvier. And then we'll say late 1700s, early 1800s. Nobody gathered more information and more knowledge and more stuff about the world that ultimately led to solving this problem of the description of evolution and the proposition of a mechanism, a correct mechanism for how things change over time. Nobody gathered and understood the world as much as Cuvier did. So we'll see the people that solved the problem, they used lots of stuff that Cuvier gathered. He was a great student of fossils, so he's really the first and the founder of paleontology. So he was really the first great paleontologist, and so we can say he started this field of science that we call paleontology. He demonstrated that at those strata that we saw in sedimentary rocks, he conclusively demonstrated that the lower down we go in these times, we get very different kinds of biota represented. The farther we go back from today, the more different things are as we go farther back into the past. He also conclusively proved that extinction is real. There were things that existed in the past that no longer exist today. One of the ways he did that was by describing fossils of organisms that are so big and so apparent that there really is nowhere in the world. So, I mean, one of the alternative explanations for things that appear to have gone extinct is, oh, they're somewhere we haven't found them yet. Okay? And there's lots of things that are hard to find, but some of these things that are so big, by this time people are knowing enough about the world that there's no place that those things could hide, and the most realistic explanation is that they are gone. So by this time, we have the idea that there are things that lived in the past that no longer live today. And even not just species of things, but whole groups of things. Remember the lumpiness of life? There are whole big lumps of life that have hundreds of species of very somewhat relatively similar things, and they're all gone. Okay? So things like trilobites, which are an extinct group of arthropods that have been extinct for a few 100 million years. They were very common on Earth for a long time, and they're gone. There are none today. They've been gone, and they've been gone for a long time. All of those species of that one piece of life are extinct. And so by now, once we get to Cuvier, extinction happens. In fact, remember we said lineages of organisms do two things. That is what? They transform, change within lineages over time. Lineages diversify. One lineage becomes two. Lineages also do something else. They go extinct. Okay? In fact, like I think I said almost all the species that have ever existed on Earth, 98, 99% of them are extinct. They don't exist today in 2016. Okay, that's the nature of life on Earth. Lineages transform, diversify, and they go extinct. Okay? The things that we have today are these lineages that are continuing to exist today. Some lineages, as we will see, give rise to other lineages, and most don't. And sometimes big bushy pieces of these trees have nothing that makes it today. So this might be like our trilobites. You know, hundreds and hundreds of species of these things that have these characteristics that we can use to lump them together into a glob here. In fact, I'm jumping ahead 50, 60, 70 years. When we started drawing these things? if you draw these, what do you see about the nature of life? It's lumpy, okay? There's our answer to our question. They didn't think of the world this way, but there's our lumpiness. But here's a big lump that disappeared. All of those things are extinct. So by Cuvier's time, extinction is a reality. They don't understand so much about the processes, but it's something that does take place. He's also the founder of something that we call comparative anatomy. And this is taking parts from living organisms and comparing the similar parts. Okay, like comparing the eyes across a whole bunch of different living organisms. And not only can you do comparative anatomy across extant individuals, but you can go back in time using the fossil record and also do comparative anatomy. Not so well on eyes because they don't fossilize very well, but on things, hard parts, shells, bones, exoskeletons, leaves, twigs, things like that. So you can do comparative anatomy and compare the characteristics of like parts across extant organisms, and you can do it in the past, comparing extant things with extinct things, and extinct things across different pieces of time. And we'll see when we solve this problem that this is one of the big fields of information that really provides a lot of information to solve the problem. Lots of it comes from paleontology, lots of it comes from biogeography that we erased already, and lots of it comes from comparative anatomy, and the first big comparative anatomist was Cuvier. Okay, so he's comparing things, and you can compare things at different stages. You can compare morphology across adults, but you can also compare morphologies across embryos, or larvae and adults. All the things that you can think of, you can do this and compare across different individuals of different taxa. This is what comparative anatomy is about. And nowadays, we don't have to just use anatomy. You can use comparative behavior. You can look at comparative biochemistry, right? We can compare gene sequences across different organisms and across even pieces of time. Or we can compare polypeptide sequences. Those are all things that would be part of comparative anatomy, some of which that he didn't do because they didn't have that technology or understanding yet, but certainly an expert on comparing hard parts, particularly skeletal nature. One of the things that he recognized in his view, based on his experience and observations, is that there is no continuum of life. It is as Linnaeus sees it, in these lumps, and there is no steady increase in complexity. Remember when the scala naturae, remember it was kind of like from not very complex to very complex, and it was ordered in a line. If you look at life, it's not like that. It's not organized linearly. There is tremendous complexity all over the place, and there is tremendous relative simplicity all over the place. So you might have something up here that you would call a complex animal, but there are lots of plants that are more complicated than those complex animals. So complexity and simplicity are all over this big thing that we call life. There's not some directionality to it, and there's not some linear march from simple things to more complicated things. That's a very different way of looking at life than people had in the past. He was still of the notion that a little bit of an essentialist, and he thought that these things that we call species were created by divine intervention, and each of these different species had their place in the world. That was a very economical place. They had purpose, and that's what they did. And it was really difficult for them to depart from those particular natures. But again, he's solving some problems and giving credence to some of these very big, important questions. And maybe most importantly, the kind of stuff that he discovered and wrote about and described serve as the evidence that other people will use later to solve this problem. He and some of the others, remember we talked about natural theology, understanding the nature of God by studying nature. People like Lamarck and people like Houge really didn't hold with those kinds of notions, so they were really against this idea of natural theology. But you got to remember at this same time, when we talked about people with opportunities to do things, one of the big groups of people that have opportunities to do things are people that are also, they're clergy people, they're involved in organized religions, and this field of natural theology and science, they were being done by the same people. So these people are living in both worlds. And so that's one of the things that colors their thinking and really, in some cases, limits what they can potentially solve. Okay. The next person we can look at is Charles Lyell, and he's from England. Let's see, I think we'll just put him 1800s. He was born in 1797, but he probably didn't do much before he was 3. So, 1800s. I can just say he was probably the world's best geologist at that time. In some ways, he might be the world's most famous geologist. So he studied the physical nature of the earth, but he wrote a lot about biology too. Some of the things he wrote about in biology was that he thought a lot about organic evolution. Remember, there are people coming up with these ideas, and so there are other people thinking about them. He was thoroughly convinced that the earth is a lot older than it really is. It's not thousands of years old, but it's a lot older than that. And also, human beings are a lot older than we think they are. They've been on this earth for a lot longer time. Didn't know how much time, but a lot longer time than we think about. He was an essentialist, true and true, though. So we got these ideas that are going back 1,500 years. No, older than that. 2,500 years, and he's still sticking with this. But he writes about the importance of ecology, the environment around organisms has something to do with their characteristics. He also writes a lot about biogeography. And he focuses on things like the nature of species. What are they? What circumscribe their boundaries? He writes about competition of one species with other species and what that might have to do with their characteristics, and that there is some kind of a struggle for existence. You know, some things do better than others, and something might actually be able to outcompete something else, and then that one other thing would go away, and this other thing would continue to exist. And so there is, even though he was an essentialist, there is some room for change in characteristics over time, particularly characteristics with what he really understands, and that's the physical nature of the world. He didn't come up with this, but one of the things he wrote about is the notion or the idea of uniformitarianism. He has a 2-volume, his big work was 2-volume thing called The Principles of Geology. And in it, one of the things he writes about is this thing we call uniformitarianism. And that is, it's something different than what would be called catastrophism. So if we look at the landscape and the topography and the geomorphology of the landscape of the earth, why is it that way? How did it get that way? Well, one explanation was in the past, there were different forces acting on the earth. Different things happened in the past, and very catastrophic things happened, and it changed the physical nature of the earth. And those processes don't happen anymore, but we still have the results of them on the earth today, and we can see it that way. Okay? Lyell thinks differently. It's like, well, what if the same processes that act on the earth today, they're the same ones that have always acted on the earth in the same fashion and at the same rate, and they do the same things, and they make very small changes in the physical nature of the earth over small amounts of time. But what if the earth is really old, like I think it is? Could not these processes that act today, that make small changes in small amounts of time, could they not make big changes if we had big amounts of time? That's what uniformitarianism is about. The uniform nature in that word is it's the same the nature of these processes that have been acting through time are uniform. They haven't changed, they've always done it this way. Okay? So how many people here have been to and seen the Grand Canyon? Yeah, I went there once, stayed 5 minutes, looked, hey, check that out, turned around and left. It was kind of neat. I wanted to ride those, they have mules. Anybody ridden the mules down to the bottom? Yeah. I thought it was $5. It was like $70. I'm not paying $70. I paid $5. But how did the Grand Canyon get like that? What did I say rivers do? They do two things. They move what? And water. Downhill, yeah. So there's a river running there. It's called the Colorado River. And it's been running there for a long time. And remember, rivers move water and they move sediments. They change their courses, but they dig away at the substrate. Okay? If you don't believe that, find a little hill or something in your backyard and turn the hose on it and just leave the hose on. What's going to start happening? It's going to start eroding, and you're going to get little rills where the water concentrates and goes faster and moves sediments away. Well, that's where the Colorado River has been doing for like 150 million years in that place. And in that time, in processes that move little bits of sediment at a short amounts of time, given them a long period of time, they make something that's like, I don't know, is that a mile deep? Cut in the surface of the earth. Okay? So you don't have to invoke catastrophic processes that don't occur today, the same processes that occur today. If you give them enough time, they can make really big differences. Remember I said during the 71 Silmar earthquake, the San Gabriel Mountains went up 6 feet. Well, you have earthquakes over hundreds of thousands of years. Those processes build what? Mountains. Okay? That's what uniformitarianism is about. But Lyell is writing about physical processes, geographical processes. You can see where we're going from this, right? Well, what if there are processes like physical processes that make small changes in small amounts of time? What if there are also processes that influence biological characteristics that make small changes in small amounts of time? But what if the Earth is real old and those same processes can act over long periods of time? Might not they also result in what? Big changes, okay? Again, somebody's making an advancement, writing something down that somebody else reads, and they read it with these other questions in their mind, and it helps them solve little pieces of the puzzle, and we move forward. Again, but we carry with us this baggage of other ideas that we can't get rid of. Okay? So now we're into the 1800s. We still haven't solved our problem. Another field of human endeavor that we said helps give people ideas was what? Not science, but literature. So in 1844, there was a book called Vestiges of Natural History of Creation. Now, it was written anonymously, but after he died, people figured out it was this English guy named Robert Chambers. And he wrote this book. Again, it's really a work of fiction, but it talks about all kinds of things about the universe and about the world. So this guy was an editor of a big fancy series, an encyclopedia called Chambers Encyclopedia. But he wrote this anonymously, and this book really shook up the educated world. Let's say it was about 1844 was this book, because in it he wrote about that the fauna, the organisms of the world, have changed over time. They've evolved, one thing becoming something else throughout geological time, and the changes weren't rapid, they were very slow, and they were very gradual, and so they took a long time to make big differences. They weren't associated with catastrophic events in the history of the Earth. He applied uniformitarianism not to just physical processes, but to biological processes, as we hinted at, people might do right away. Also, his arguments were very logical and very well thought out. They made a lot of sense to people. He actually convinced some very important people that this thing that we can now call evolution actually takes place. So some of the people that this novel or this work of literature convinced of the existence of something that we call evolution was another biologist named Alfred Russel Wallace that we'll talk about on Monday probably, another biologist called Herbert Spencer, and a writer, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Those are some of the people that they understood what he was writing about, and even though it's a work of fiction, they really made a lot of sense, and perhaps really this is the way that the world works. The other important thing about this book is that there were a lot of people that didn't agree with that, and so they spent a lot of time, they were detractors, and they spent a lot of time picking at all of the little points that they considered problematic. Okay, and they made those complaints or their detractions very public, so everybody knew what, within Chambers' work, what are all the little problems? You know, he didn't use a lot of evidence to make his point. He logically worked this out, it made sense, and so it was easy for detractors to pick holes in it. Okay? One of the reasons I'm telling you that is that later on, the person who solves these problems makes sure he takes care of every one of those little things. Okay, so these are something that people would say, oh well, yeah, that's true, but what about this? Well, if you're gonna make some bold claims, you take care of all of those. What about this? Okay, so that's another function of this work of literature. Not only does it convince some people about the notion of evolution and gives some other people ideas, but it also gives them some understanding of what they're going to have to deal with if they're going to propose something that's very revolutionary. Okay? So, we've actually gone hundreds of years here and made lots of progress, but despite all these well thought out arguments and big piles of preponderance of evidence that are pointing in one direction, suggesting evolution, nobody really makes the case such that everybody else is going to understand it and buy into it. And and they certainly haven't come up with any mechanism. And so what we really need here is to kind of get rid of that baggage that we have behind us. And if your things weren't here, what would we do with the table? Wipe it clean and start all over and make our case. And when did that happen? That happened on a certain day, on the 24th of September. Why did I cover that up? Oh, 24th of November in 1859. So on that very day, what happened? Huh? It's a book. This book. This is... Put it up. What is this book? It's falling apart. It's called The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Who wrote that? Yeah, so you guys have been sitting here for a long time wondering, when's he gonna get to the guy who solves this problem? So the next guy in our little story is Charles Darwin, and that's the subject of your first reading that I have on the Moodle site. And if you haven't read that already, that's the longest reading of these extra readings we'll have this semester, but don't study all the minutiae in there. Just sit down, get relaxed, and kind of read through it. You'll learn some interesting stuff. But this is the guy that clears the table, sets forth a very clear and very well, easily understandable argument for two things. That is the fact that the world and life on it evolves, and then perhaps even more importantly, he proposes a mechanism by which this takes place. What's the mechanism called? Natural selection. It's in the title of the book. Charles Darwin is from the 1800s. He lives throughout most of the 1800s. He's born on the 12th of February in 1809. And another real famous person was born on the exact same day, the 12th of February, 1809, in Sinking Spring Farm in Kentucky. And who's that? Abraham Lincoln. So these two extremely influential men, born on the very same day, two sides of the globe. One of them, Charles Darwin, is going to solve a lot of things in the world. So if that's true, he probably has lots of what?
Time, power.
All of that, yeah. Lots of money and lots of time. And then on the other side of the globe from Kentucky, he moved to Illinois and Indiana later on, so people don't forget that he's from Kentucky. Another extremely influential person is born in a completely different situation. Very poor, and they still become very great humans in the history of Earth. So Charles Darwin is born into a family with money. His dad's a doctor, and his dad was a doctor. Okay, so just like today, people that are doctors tend to have lots of money. If you got lots of money, you got time. So he grows up with time on his hands, and he actually becomes a tremendous naturalist, collecting flowers, insects, shooting birds, and just having a grand old time growing up. And he becomes very familiar with the life around him in England. He also, if your parents are doctors, how will they want you to do in school? There's a lot of pressure, yeah, to do well in school, and they have high hopes for you. So they also want him to be a doctor, and he's got no pension for. Yeah, it's like me. I could never. I cut up dead stuff all the time. I don't think I could take a scalpel to somebody that was alive. On TV, I look away. I can't watch it. Even a shot, and even if it's a fake needle on TV, I can't look. So I'd be like Darwin. I can't be this doctor thing. But there's another thing that's very respectable that you could be, and that's a clergy person. You could be a parson, a pastor of a church. Good thing about that is, yeah, you're kind of busy on Sundays, and you got to prepare stuff, and you got to deal with other people, but you got a lot of time on your hands. So that's a thing that really appeals to him. But when he goes to college at Edinburgh, and he actually moves on after that. He goes to Cambridge, but that was his goal, to study theology and become a preacher. It's a good way to make a living, and it's a good thing to do. But while in school, he started meeting other people. In particular, other biologists, people that were, hey, look, that's one of the things about going to school. You find other people that are like you. And you like, collecting and studying flowers, and you think you're a dork. And you meet some other dorks that study flowers, you realize, hey, this is not so dorky. I can do this. My friends do this. And so you can make a living doing these things. And that's one of the things that you guys are learning, in school. You get in a big school with enough people, you find people like you and realize, hey, everything's good. There's nothing wrong with doing what I'm doing. So he does that. He also meets professors that really foster his understanding of the natural world. Particularly, he's real into beetles too, not Ringo and Paul They were also from England, but different kinds of people. And that's one of the groups he's real interested in. So they have club meetings, there's a natural history club, there's professors that are all interested in what he's doing, and he's getting along with people, and so he's spending a lot more time doing that, and less time pursuing his theology degrees. And then this guy, Henslow, that he's been working with, he finds out that there's going to be a trip, okay? So he's in a country that's England. Remember we talked about a week ago, like the Roman Empire? I think there was one bigger empire in the history of the world, and that's what? The British Empire. And if you're going to be a ruler of the world, you got to be the rulers of the sea. And if you're going to be the rulers of the sea, what do you got to do? You got to know what's out there. And so they would constantly send out expeditions on ships to go out to other places of the world and map them and see what they had to offer, see what was worth taking, and take it if you can, and make it part of the empire. So that's one of the things that they did. And again, you have to do that if you're going to maintain control of as much of the earth as possible, and that's what they wanted to do. So England was always sending out these ships. This guy Henslow found out that they were going to send out a ship, and they were going to go around the world, and he thought that would be a great opportunity for somebody that also studied biology, because that's one of the things that they did on these ships too. They also took along a naturalist that collected specimens and brought them back, because that was more knowledge about other parts of the world for England. And so he told Charles Darwin, he said, hey, you ought to go on this trip. And he sponsored him, and he stuck up for him and tried to get him on this ship. I don't think Darwin's dad was too happy about it, or he thought it was the greatest thing, but he went along and he did it, okay? And this trip around the world lasted 5 years, so it was no short trip. Anybody know the name of the boat? Yeah, so it was Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle. And their trip was from 1831 to 1836. How old was Charles Darwin when he went on this trip? He was your age. He was 22 years old. Imagine 20 and 22 and signing up for something like that. You know, that's no weekend in Las Vegas, you know. I think he didn't sign up for 5 years. It took longer than they thought, but that's something. That's a big deal. Do you think it will influence you going on a trip like that? Oh yeah, this was the greatest influence in his whole life. So much so, you know how much he traveled after that? He didn't go anywhere ever again. He really didn't. He might have went to France once or something, but he didn't go anywhere. He was done. Okay? But the stuff that he learned was paramount to him figuring out these problems and answering these questions that we've been talking about. The captain of the ship was a guy named Robert Fitzroy, and he was of the ancient age of 28. I can't imagine that either. Being 28 years old and you're given command of this ship to do that expedition. I wouldn't have done it. Like me? Can't do things like that. But he did, okay? The other thing is that Charles Darwin was not the naturalist on this ship. Why did Charles Darwin go on the trip if he wasn't the naturalist? They already had a naturalist. His name was Robert McCormick. That was his job. So why was Charles Darwin on the trip? Why does he need a professional friend? You got a whole boatload of guys. You got all the friends you want. Exactly. This is England. This is the 1800s. This is the captain of the ship. Who does he talk to? I think he only talks to one person. I think the second mate, the next guy in charge. I tell you what I want to be done. You go tell somebody else, and they may even tell somebody else what needs to be done. He cannot fraternize with the people on the ship. He is of this level in society. They are down here. But Charles Darwin is from my level of society. So that's why he went on the trip. Somebody for the captain to talk to, a learned person. they get over to South America, and that guy, Robert McCormick, who was the naturalist, he didn't get to do anything. They let Charles Darwin do all the fun stuff. He got to go on land, he got to go out collecting stuff, he got to hike around, and so the other guy was like, I'm out of here, see ya. He got off the ship, went back home. And so then, in effect, Charles Darwin became the naturalist on the Beagle. He got to do all of the fun stuff. And I'll show you a map, maybe Wednesday, of where they went. Maybe next week. No, it's today's Wednesday. Yeah. Sometime before the semester's over, I'll show you the map. And what they do is they leave England and they go down south and they stop at a few islands, even off the coast of Africa, and then they cut all the way across the Atlantic and go to South America. And that's where they spend their time, working down the east coast of South America and around the Horn and back up the west coast. And that's where they spend most of the time on many of these years on this trip. And in it, this guy Charles Darwin that comes from England, from a place that he knew the plants and the animals, the geography, he knew so much about England. And England is relatively simple. It's an island, and it's in fairly high latitudes. It's not that sophisticated biologically. I just picture green grass. I've never been there. I just picture green and rocky walls and stuff like that. But now he goes to other parts of the world that are very different. So he goes to places that are tropical rainforests, which are the most biologically diverse habitats on Earth. He goes to deserts, some of the deserts that he went and visited. Anybody ever flown over the Atacama Desert before? I have done that. I don't need to go to Mars. The Atacama Desert is just like Mars. There's nothing there. It never rains, okay? And in each of these, and he goes to many islands. Remember I said where are weird places on Earth? Islands. He figures out why islands are so weird, but it's very influential. That's biogeography, okay? When he left on this trip, too, this problem of the origin of species, what they are and where they came from, it's already in his head. But he's an essentialist, he's a creationist, he knows where all this stuff came from, and yet these are problems in his head that need to be solved. He also took with him Volume 1 of Principles of Geology. This is actually a guy he knew in England, and he's going to turn out to be one of his good friends when he comes back. The point is, here's a smart guy at a particular time and place, and there's all these questions that are needing to be answered, and here's a person with a bunch of knowledge that they gained from their education and the people that they were around, now getting to experience with their own eyes and their own ears and their own hands differences across the globe that are going to pick at him and need explanation, and they're going to be the things that serve to answer all of those questions that other people have been proposing. We'll do the answer to that when we come back on Monday. Anybody got any questions about today's stuff? Yeah.
Wasn't he his grandfather?
Pardon?
Wasn't this guy his grandfather?
Charles Darwin's grandfather, his name was Erasmus Darwin. He was a physician. He